Sarah Miller had a quiet life, a stillness that had settled around her like the perpetual dust on the prairie since her husband William had been taken by consumption 2 years prior. She was 25, but the grief and hard living had etched lines around her eyes that made her seem older. Her small homestead, a modest cabin and a lean-to stable on the outskirts of the territory, was her world. She rarely saw another soul, save for the occasional traveling peddler or a distant neighbor passing by on the dusty road. Her days were a rhythm of chores, tending a small garden, mending clothes, and keeping the cabin clean, a constant battle against the wind and the fine red soil that seeped into everything. Lately, however, her nights had been anything but quiet. They were invaded by a recurring dream, vivid and unsettling. It was always the same, a storm, the sky bruised purple and grey, the wind howling. And through the storm she would see him. He was an Apache man, his face a stern mask of painted lines and dark eyes, his hair long and braided. But it was not his face that held her attention. It was his legs, powerful, muscled and bare. They moved with a silent, primal strength as he ran through a canyon, a landscape of jagged rock and endless sky that was both terrifying and breathtaking. The dream was a strange mix of fear and an undeniable forbidden fascination. The raw power in his form, the grace of his movement, was something she had never seen, not on any white man she had ever known. She would wake up with a gasp, the image of his ripped legs seared into her mind, her heart thrumming against her ribs. She tried to dismiss it, to tell herself it was just a dream, a lonely woman's mind playing tricks on her. But the feeling lingered, a sense of an impending change, a life she couldn't yet comprehend. It felt as if the dream was not just a figment of her imagination, but a message, a sign of something or someone coming toward her. One evening, the sky finally matched the one in her dreams. A thunderstorm, one of the most violent she had ever witnessed, rolled in from the west. The wind tore at the cabin, rattling the glass in the windows and groaning against the walls. Rain came down in sheets, a torrent that turned the red earth to mud. Sarah was huddled by the small fireplace, a book unread in her lap, her thoughts filled with the image of the Apache from her dreams. Then there was a sound that cut through the thunder, a hard, persistent knock on her door. It wasn't the kind of hesitant rap a traveler would make. It was a determined, heavy thud. Her heart leapt into her throat. Who would be out in this storm? She grabbed the shotgun from above the mantelpiece, her hands trembling as she approached the door, the cold metal a small comfort against her fear. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper against the storm's roar. There was no answer, just another series of knocks, more insistent this time. Taking a deep breath, she slowly unbolted the door and pulled it open just enough to see. The wind and rain lashed at her face, but she could make out a figure on the porch. He was tall, drenched, and leaning heavily against the doorframe. As a flash of lightning split the sky, she saw him clearly. It was the man from her dreams. The painted lines on his face were smeared by the rain, his long hair matted to his head. He was clutching his side, and she could see the dark stain seeping through his buckskin tunic. His legs, wet and gleaming in the brief light, were as muscular and defined as she had dreamed. His eyes, dark and piercing, met hers. He didn't speak, but his look was a silent plea for help. The raw fear that had gripped her a moment before was replaced by a wave of a strange, urgent compulsion. The dream, the storm, the man standing before her, it was all one singular, impossible moment. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic that she couldn't leave him out there. She quickly pulled him inside, the man stumbling forward as she closed the door against the howling storm. He collapsed on the floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. The smell of wet earth, blood, and something wild and unfamiliar filled her small home. Sarah knelt beside him, the shotgun forgotten on the floor. His wound was a ragged gash, bleeding freely. He was a warrior, a man from a world she only knew through whispered rumors and fearful stories. But in that moment he was just a man, hurt and in need. The dream had not just been a dream, it had been a foreshadowing. The Apache's ripped legs had been a sign, a silent promise that he was coming, and now he was here, a trespasser not just in her home, but in her very existence. The first few days were a blur of fear and frantic effort. Sarah had dragged the unconscious Apache man to the hearth, his heavy body a dead weight she struggled to move. She cut away the blood-soaked buckskin from his side, revealing a deep, ugly gash from what looked like a rifle shot. The wound was already inflamed, the edges an angry red. Infection, she knew, was a death sentence out here. even more so for a man who didn't know the land's sparse remedies. Using a clean rag and water she'd heated in a kettle, she carefully cleaned the wound, ignoring the silent scream of every instinct she possessed. She remembered the salves her husband's mother had taught her to make from local herbs. She had a small jar of poultice made from yarrow and comfrey root, which she had prepared for her own small nicks and bruises. With trembling hands, she applied the foul-smelling mixture, wrapping the wound tightly with strips of clean linen she tore from an old bedsheet. The warrior, despite his pain, remained unnervingly silent, only a low groan escaping his lips as she worked. His muscles, so powerful in her dreams, were now limp and unresponsive. The reality of his physical presence was overwhelming. He smelled of rain, smoke, and something else, a wild, earthy scent that was entirely his own. For 2 days, he was lost to a fever, his body shaking and burning. Sarah sat by his side, feeding him spoonfuls of water and weak broth, her own meals forgotten. The wind outside had died down, replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the man's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. She found herself watching him, her initial terror slowly giving way to a strange sense of purpose. She wasn't just a lonely widow in a desolate cabin. She was a nurse, a caretaker, the sole barrier between this man and death. She studied his face, the strong jaw, the high cheekbones, the long dark lashes that rested against his cheeks. He wasn't a savage, as the townspeople whispered, but a man, just as she was a woman. The stark lines of his body, which had haunted her dreams, were now a testament to his strength, a strength she hoped would pull him through. On the 3rd night, his fever broke. She woke to find his eyes open, dark and clear, watching her. They were intelligent eyes, filled with a sharp awareness that made her feel transparent. She instinctively reached for the shotgun which she had kept leaning against the wall, but he didn't move. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "You've been ill," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. He just nodded, his gaze unwavering. He tried to speak, but a hoarse croak was all that came out. Sarah quickly poured him a cup of water and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, his hand, calloused and strong, brushing against hers. A jolt, like a tiny electric shock, ran through her. She pulled back her hand as if burned. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "What is your name?" she asked, a sudden curiosity overpowering her fear. He waited a long moment before answering, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Cochise." Sarah's breath hitched. The name, while not a common Apache name she would have known, sounded powerful, resonant. It was a name that fit the man in her dreams. "My name is Sarah," she said, feeling a ridiculous need to introduce herself. He simply nodded again, his eyes still fixed on her. He pointed to his wound, and then to her. It was a silent, direct question. Why had she helped him? Why hadn't she left him to die in the storm? She had no answer that would make sense to him. "It's not right to leave a man to die," she stammered, feeling foolish. Cochise's lips thinned into what might have been a ghost of a smile. He shifted, wincing with pain, and sat up with great effort. He was a presence in her small cabin, a force of nature confined to the space she had once shared with her quiet, bookish husband. His long hair was loose now, falling over his shoulders. His body, which had seemed so ethereal and powerful in her dreams, was now a fragile reality, broken and in her care. He pointed to his legs, then to her, a gesture she finally understood. He was asking her if he was the man from her dreams. The man with the ripped, muscular legs. He had seen her watching him, her expression a mix of awe and fear. A blush crept up her neck and face, a heat she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It was a question she was not ready to answer, a truth too intimate to share with this stranger who had walked from her dreams into her home. He was a trespasser, a patient, and now a silent, knowing companion. The distance between them was not just cultural, but a vast silent space that held all the unsaid things. The dreams were no longer just her secret. He was here, and he knew. The cabin became a strange, small world unto itself. Sarah nursed Cochise back to health with a quiet determination. The rhythm of her days now centered around his needs. She changed his dressings, made him bone broth, and watched as the raw, angry wound on his side slowly began to close. As he grew stronger, a new kind of tension settled in. The initial frantic necessity of survival was replaced by a slow-burning awareness of each other. The silence between them was no longer just a symptom of his weakness, but a conscious, palpable presence. He would watch her as she went about her chores, his dark eyes following her every move, studying her with a deep, unnerving intensity. She found herself growing accustomed to his gaze, and even in moments she would never admit, finding a certain comfort in it. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and a few broken words. She learned he had been on a journey to find his people after a skirmish with a rival tribe. He had been separated from his group, and the bullet wound was from a trapper who had ambushed him. He had been fleeing, running through the thunderstorm, and had seen her cabin a solitary light in the vast, unforgiving darkness. The more he healed, the more she noticed the details of his body, the very details that had populated her dreams. The powerful calves, the thick thighs, the corded muscles in his arms. He was a man built for the open country, for strength and endurance. The way he moved, even in the cramped confines of her cabin, was with a silent, feline grace. He was a stark, powerful contrast to her late husband, a man whose hands had known the feel of a ledger more than a rifle. One afternoon, a week into his recovery, she was outside hanging laundry on a line. The sun was hot and unforgiving. She heard the cabin door creak open and turned to see Cochise standing in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He was holding a small, flat piece of dark wood. He held it out to her. It was a carving of a hawk, its wings spread as if in flight, its details so intricate she could see the individual feathers. It was a testament to a deep patience and a skill she could only imagine. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble, the words sounding foreign and unpracticed. Sarah's hand trembled as she took it. The wood was smooth and cool against her palm. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a gratitude that felt too big for the small gift. He just nodded, his gaze as unreadable as ever, and went back inside. The hawk, a symbol of freedom and foresight, felt like a silent conversation, a bridge between their worlds. It was a sign that he saw her not just as a caretaker, but as someone worthy of a gift. Later that day, she brought him a meal of stew. He was sitting on the floor by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife. The act was a silent, dangerous one, a reminder of the raw, untamed world he came from. "What were you running from?" she asked, the question bubbling up from a deep, unbidden curiosity. "The trapper, I mean. Was he hunting you?" Cochise paused his work, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "White man hunts for pelts, hunts for gold, hunts for land, hunts for people like me," he said, the words coming out slowly, deliberately. "He sees a bounty, not a man." The bluntness of his statement hit her with a physical force. She had heard the stories, the casual racist conversations in the town's general store, but to hear it from him, so directly and without bitterness, was a different kind of truth. It was the truth of the hunted. Her world, a world of cabins and chores and silent loneliness, was a world of privilege he did not possess. She sat down across from him, the small distance between them feeling like a chasm. "Not all white people are like that," she said, her voice soft, feeling the desperate need to defend her own kind. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, weary sadness. "Some are not," he said simply, his gaze holding hers. It was a simple, profound acceptance of her statement, but it did not diminish the weight of his own experience. He was a man who had been hunted, and she was the woman who had sheltered him. The chasm between them was cultural, racial, and historical. It was a gap that felt impossible to bridge, yet here they were in her small cabin, sharing a meal and a fragile, unspoken understanding. The dreams had brought him to her, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous than any vision she could have imagined. His presence was no longer a dream, it was a consequence, and with it came the quiet, simmering fear of what would happen if anyone found him there. The arrival of a posse in the distance shattered the fragile peace they had built. It was a cold, bright morning, and Sarah was outside feeding the chickens when she saw them. 4 men on horseback, a cloud of dust rising behind them, their movements purposeful, and heading in her direction. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had heard the rumors in town. A posse was looking for a hostile who had escaped after a skirmish with a bounty hunter. They were a dangerous group, led by a man named Elias Thorne, known for his cruelty and his unwavering belief in the civilizing power of the noose. She ran back inside, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "They're coming," she said, her voice a low, frantic whisper. "A posse. They're looking for an Apache." Cochise, who was sitting by the fire, stood up in one fluid motion, the muscles in his legs coiling with a familiar tension. He grabbed the rifle she had found in the lean-to, cleaned and oiled, and went to the window, peering out from behind the curtain. He didn't ask her who they were. He knew. He was a wanted man, a fugitive on his own land. The fear in her eyes was all the confirmation he needed. "I will leave," he said, his voice flat and calm. He started for the door, but Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the hard muscle. "No," she said, her voice more insistent than she intended. "They'll find you. The horses will follow your tracks." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sharp, calculating intelligence. He knew she was right. They had no horses for a quick getaway, and the open prairie was a death sentence. "They won't look for me here," he said, a cold certainty in his tone. "Not with a white woman. They will not believe I am with you. They'll search the cabin," she pleaded, her mind racing, trying to find a solution, any solution. His gaze flickered over her small home, then to the floorboards. Under the cabin there is a space. It was a crawl space she had used for storage, a small cramped hole in the ground, but it was their only chance. Without another word he knelt, pulled back a small rug, and lifted a loose floorboard. The space was dark and smelled of damp earth. He looked at her, his face a mask of resolute calm. "If they ask, you know nothing. You are alone. I won't let them take you," she said, the words coming from a place she didn't know she had. It was a fierce, protective instinct that overrode her fear of the law, of Thorn, and of the cultural chasm that separated them. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her choice, and slipped into the dark hole, pulling the floorboard back over his head. Sarah quickly replaced the rug, her hands shaking, her heart hammering a wild drumbeat against her ribs. She grabbed her knitting and sat in a rocking chair by the fire, trying to make her breathing even, her expression calm. The sound of horses and the low rumble of male voices grew louder. She could see them now, pulling up in front of her cabin. The posse leader, Elias Thorne, dismounted with a cruel smile on his face, his eyes pale and sharp, scanning the area. He was a mountain of a man, his presence as threatening as a coiled rattlesnake. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low growl. "Heard you live alone out here." "I do," Sarah said, her voice thin but steady. She looked at him with an innocent, slightly bewildered expression. "Is there a problem, sir?" Thorne's eyes narrowed as he looked her over, a sneer on his face. "We're looking for an Apache, got a bullet in him. Been seen in these parts." Sarah feigned a slight shake of her head. "I haven't seen anyone, sir. No one's been by in days." Thorne and his men began to search the property. They looked in the stable, behind the cabin, and under the lean-to. Their boots crunched on the gravel, a sound that felt deafening to Sarah as she sat there, her heart in her throat. One of the men, a younger boy with a cruel look in his eye, came and stood in the doorway, his eyes darting around the interior of her small cabin. Sarah gripped her knitting needle so tightly her knuckles went white. She prayed he wouldn't look at the floorboards, at the tiny seam where the wood was slightly ajar. "You sure, Mom?" Thorne asked, his voice low and threatening, standing in the doorway now, his gaze fixed on her. "It's a serious thing. Harboring a savage could get you killed." "I am a respectable woman, sir," she said, her voice gaining strength from her righteous indignation. "I have no truck with heathens. You're welcome to look, but you'll find nothing." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching for a crack in her composure. He saw none. He grunted and turned away, satisfied for now, and the posse rode off, their horses kicking up a fresh cloud of dust. Sarah watched them go, her body trembling with a fear that had been held in check for too long. Only when the last rider was a distant speck on the horizon did she finally breathe. She slowly knelt and pulled up the floorboard. Cochise emerged from the dark hole, his clothes covered in dirt, a silent understanding passing between them. He looked at her, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. She had lied for him. She had stood up to Thorne and his men, risking her own safety and her reputation for a man who had walked out of her dreams and into her life. In that moment, the distance between them, racial, cultural, historical, seemed to shrink to nothing. They were allies now, bound by a dangerous secret and a shared, silent defiance. The hunter and the hunted had found a sanctuary, and she had become a part of his escape. After the posse rode off, the cabin was filled with a silence heavier than before, a stillness that had been earned through a shared, heart-stopping terror. Sarah and Cochise looked at each other, the relief a palpable force between them. The risk she had taken, the lies she had told, had created an irreversible bond. He was no longer just a wounded man she had found, or the subject of her dreams. He was a part of her now, a dangerous, hidden secret that had taken root in her quiet life. Over the next few days, Cochisi's wound healed completely. The skin was scarred, but the muscle beneath was whole. He became restless, an untamed energy coiled inside him that the small cabin could no longer contain. He would stand at the window, staring out at the vast empty prairie, a deep, weary longing in his dark eyes. He was a creature of the open land, and being confined, even in safety, was a form of slow torture. One evening, he sat across from her by the fire, sharpening a new knife he had fashioned from a piece of old metal. The rasp of the stone was the only sound in the room. "I must go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My people, they will be looking for me. They will not know if I am alive or dead." Sarah's heart sank, a heavy, leaden feeling in her chest. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't prepared for the pain of it. Her loneliness, once a quiet, manageable sorrow, now felt like a gaping wound. He had filled the silence in her life with his presence, his quiet strength, and his unnerving awareness. "The posse," she said, a final desperate argument. "Thorn knows you're in the area. He'll be back." "I will go west," he said, "where his kind do not follow. There is a pass in the mountains. I can lose them there." He was not asking for her permission, but telling her his intention. He was a warrior, and his path was not hers, but the simple, shared moments they had experienced, the long silences, the shared danger, had created something more than just a caretaker and her patient. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "When you find them, the posse." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a clear, unmistakable tenderness in his eyes. "I will not forget you," he said. He reached across and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You saved my life, Sarah. You gave me back my people." The simple touch was a revelation. It was a physical testament to a connection that transcended words and worlds. The dreams, the danger, the days of silent companionship, they had all led to this moment. She looked at his face, at the stern lines of his jaw and the dark, knowing eyes, and saw the man who had haunted her nights now looking at her with an affection she hadn't known she craved. He was the most alive person she had ever met, a stark, undeniable truth in her otherwise muted existence. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he was ready to leave. He was a different man than the one who had collapsed on her floor in the storm. His body was strong, his movements purposeful. He stood by the door, the hawk carving in his hand, a small gift for her to remember him by. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and serious, "come with me." The words hung in the air, a breathtaking, impossible proposition. Leave her home, the only home she had ever known? Go with a man she barely knew, a man of a different people, into a world of danger and uncertainty? It was madness. And yet the alternative was a return to the lonely silence she had endured for years. The quiet life she had lived felt like a slow death now, a pale imitation of what she had tasted with him. She looked at him, his face a mix of hope and the stark, rugged realism of his world. She didn't have to answer. He knew her world, her risks. He knew the prejudices of her people. To be with him would mean a life as a pariah, a white woman who had chosen an Apache warrior. But to stay would mean a lifetime of regretting the choice not taken. She looked at his legs, the same strong, powerful legs from her dreams. They had brought him to her. They had carried him through the storm, through the dangers of the prairie, and into her home. They were not just a symbol of his physical strength, but a sign of his destiny, a destiny that had, for a brief, beautiful moment, intertwined with her own. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. His expression remained unchanged. He simply nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. He knew. He had expected her answer, but he had offered the choice regardless. He reached out and gently laid the carving on the table. He opened the door and stepped outside, turning back for one last long look. Then he was gone, a silent figure disappearing into the dawn, his powerful stride carrying him toward a new horizon. Sarah watched him go, a mix of sorrow and gratitude swelling in her chest. He was gone, but the echo of his presence, the feel of his hand and the memory of his kindness would stay with her forever. The dream had been a promise of his arrival, but the reality was the long, quiet echo of his departure. She was no longer a lonely widow, but a woman who had seen beyond the walls of her world and who would carry the mark of a powerful, forbidden love in her heart until her last breath.